Thanks, Nona, and congratulations again to the award recipients for all the important contribution. And hello and welcome to this plenary presentation of the ASLO 2021 virtual conference. So my name is Patrizia Ziveri, and I'm an ICREA research professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. As Nona said, I'm part of the ASLO 2021 Scientific Committee, and my task today is to introduce this very exciting plenary presentation and also our fantastic plenary speaker. So I'm very honored to introduce Professor Lora Fleming, that is Chair and Director of the European Centre of Environment and Human Health at the University of Exeter Medical School in the UK. She's a physician and epidemiologist and a world expert on human health and environmental health, including green space and blue space. And she has received several important awards, for example, the Ocean and Human Awards from the Edward De Croix Foundation and also the IOC Brun Award. And she led also some important European initiatives like the H2020 project, like Blue Health and Seas, Oceans and Public Health in Europe. She also collaborated to many other initiatives. And really, the more I learned about her career trajectory and biography, and the more I got fascinated about Lora. And she's really a stellar scientist, and also I think she's really provided an important contribution to link science, society, and policy. And she's a scientist, also a woman that have dedicated some of her work to communities and people that have less. And I think that is also relevant in our world and in science. The human population has become really a dominant component of the Earth system and environmental change. So in fact, there is this unsustainable trajectory of human development, demonstrating the need to be addressed in an integrated manner. And the ocean is the most important system for the sustainability of life. And the topic of today's plenary session is absolutely key. So Lora is here today to speak to us about linking the health of the oceans and the human. And before starting the presentation, I would like also to remind to the audience to please type in your question in the chat during the presentation or afterwards, so that we will have time later to discuss. And now I would like to welcome to this virtual stage, Professor Lora Fleming. Please.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Let me just get this going. And thank you so much for your kind both welcome and inviting me to present to this wonderful group. I also really need to thank Chris, Sue, and Nona. I would not be here without them. So I'm very grateful to the support people for this conference. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite areas, which is ocean or oceans and human health. I'll first talk a little bit about the context of ocean and human health, risks and particularly benefits and opportunities. And I'll point out that I am speaking as a physician epidemiologist, and this will be quite different from some of the other talks you've been hearing. Then I'll talk about some other projects in this area and some possible next action with a focus on something called NHS or National Health Service Ocean. So many of you have already heard of the planetary boundary idea or framework as proposed by Rockstrom and others, which is basically, at least from the point of the ocean, if not the rest of the planet, we have exceeded our planetary boundaries or are in the process of doing so. I am very involved in public health, so I also like Kate Rayworth's so-called donut, which fits within the prior scheme, and it includes the planetary boundaries with people. So it includes things like social equity, gender equality, et cetera. And there's a whole new area that's particularly popular, I think, in the public health community of planetary health, but I think that ocean or oceans and human health fits in lots of different frameworks, or at least I can make that case. So One Health, ecosystem services, ecological public health. And also within the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm particularly fond of because I think that we cannot deliver the Sustainable Development Goals unless we deliver the health of both the environment, ecosystems, planet, as well as human health and well-being. And then to do a very simple schematic of how I think of oceans and human health, it's really that our health is inextricably linked with that of the ocean. And so clearly this area is about interconnections and interdependence, but it also it implies a complexity of science and challenges. And it also means that there have to be very intertransdisciplinary approaches across institutions, sectors, both locally and international. And personally, I'm particularly interested in the benefits and opportunities, not just the risks to both the ocean's health and human health. And I would argue that with COVID and the UN Ocean and Ecosystem Restoration Decades, that the time is now to do this. So when I look back on the so-called history of ocean human health, it probably goes much further back than this, but I originally was involved when the National Academy of Science produced a lovely little book, which is still fairly relevant, called From Monsoons to Microbes. And in the US, there was subsequently a lot of work in this area, and there continues to be NSF and National Science Foundation, National Institute of Environmental Health Science, NIEHS, funded work in this, in the area of ocean and human health. In Europe, really the Marine Board led the way with a white paper published in 2013, and then it became much more of an interest in Europe. Although I think Europe has really taken an attitude of focusing less on the risks and more on benefits, innovation, opportunities. One other thing I think is important is the whole ocean literacy movement, which I am very encouraged to see now involves not just dissemination of our research, but actual community involvement and engagement and co-creation. And relative to that, you'll hear me use, and I'm sure it's pissing off several people in the audience, but I am a physician and epidemiologist. I interchangeably use ocean and oceans. The ocean literacy community is very big on the idea of a global ocean. I also work with many ecologists and others who find the whole idea of a global ocean an anathema and would prefer to speak about oceans, seas, local ecosystems. As such, I'm not going to get involved, but I do use them interchangeably. So from a human health point of view, a lot of work has been done around the risks to human health from interacting with ocean, and it's quite historic as well. But most recently, probably the biggest risk is climate change, and coming with climate change is extreme weather, floods, sea level rise, and in the not so distant future, ocean acidification. Harmful algal blooms and other toxins, I know you all know this, but this can lead to contamination of the food chain with morbidity and mortality for humans and other animals. Fisheries destruction globally and in all aquatic systems. Microbial pollution, both directly from pollution, microbial pollution going into the sea at the coast, but also from runoff off of terrestrial areas, and antimicrobial resistance associated with that. And increasingly a huge amount of attention, I would argue almost a revisiting of the whole issue of man-made chemicals and plastics. And I would draw your attention to the Monaco report from December 2020 that did a very nice job of summarizing human health, ocean, and chemical pollution. I've had the privilege of working for the last decade plus with colleagues at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health and the University of Exeter Medical School in the UK, but also increasingly globally, focusing on benefits and opportunities from interacting with the ocean. The obvious one is seafood and aquaculture, which provide protein and essential nutrients, which can prevent chronic diseases in many populations around the world. A huge amount of modeling, forecasting, things like sensors, AUVs, et cetera, and early warning systems such as for hurricanes have been developed around the ocean. Marine biodiversity is increasingly supplying us with important natural products ranging from chemotherapy drugs to possibly in the future alternatives to plastics. And marine renewable energy offers up the hope of replacing our dependence on fossil fuels. And finally, there's an increasing evidence base that interacting with blue spaces, particularly coasts, are good for our health and well-being. And that's the area that I and others have been focusing on. And I'll just give a very brief so-called taster of some of the research we've done. So this is one of my favorite studies. It was done now over a decade ago, and it was done by colleagues of mine at the center in the University of Plymouth. And what they did is they took a bunch of people and showed them, said, you're gonna have the same hotel room, but you get to choose your view. You can either have a green view, a blue view, or a cityscape view. And almost uniformly, people, even in landlocked countries, pick the blue view. And at that time, they were willing to pay substantially more for that view. And I would argue, thanks to the pandemic, I think that people are willing to pay even more now. And this is some work led by Dr. Sarai Poso that we collaborated in. And she did an online survey of over 5,000 people in 9 countries, looking at their mental health and their extent of physical contact slash view, seeing blue and green spaces, and the extent of lockdown. And the bottom line is that your health was much better. Your mental health was reported much better if you had physical contact, a little less, but still positive for just seeing blue and green spaces, particularly for people who were in extreme lockdowns. And I think this is something we need to take into account in the future, as unfortunately the pandemic seems to continue. We've also done some big data analysis. This was an early study using census data in the UK, looking at residents, and it was residents' distance from coastal areas in the UK. And we asked people about their self-reported health, which is a very strong predictive variable. And the bottom line is the closer you were to the coast, the better your self-reported health, even taking into account things like income and education. And this, we used other databases and found that this was true when people moved to the coast. And from a public health point of view, from my point of view, it was really important that it was the strongest effects were in poorer communities. We've also tried to think about people who can't get to blue spaces. And obviously with lockdown, many of us couldn't get to blue spaces. But when we started the research, it was more about people in care facilities, hospitals, et cetera. And with colleagues at the University of Plymouth, used virtual reality, and in this case, randomized people who came in for dental care. They got either standard care, a virtual city, or a virtual Wembley, which is a beautiful blue space in Devon, UK, and they could interact with it while they were undergoing dental treatment. And those who experienced the blue virtual reality reported much less pain directly afterwards, but even more so after a week or so. And they were more likely to want to sign up for dental care again, which is important also from a public health point of view. And this was even in real situations such as tooth extractions and fillings. We've also been doing some other studies that I'll just very briefly highlight. The Horizon 2020, which is wonderful EU funding, funded the Blue Health Study, which ended in December this past year. And we worked with colleagues all over Europe looking at evidence for whether or not blue spaces, and a lot of it was coastal, interacting with blue spaces is good for people's mental health and well-being, and physical health as well. We came up with a number of tools that can be used by communities as well as planners, including decision support tools. We also, as I said, collected a lot of evidence and a large survey across 18 countries, including 14 in Europe, which looked at how people interact with blue spaces and how it makes them feel. Another study, which is ongoing, the Global Challenge Research Fund, or GCRF Blue Communities Project, led by Mel Austin Professor Mel Austin at the University of Plymouth, is fascinating. We're interacting with 4 Southeast Asian countries, and it's around marine spatial planning and local populations interacting around marine spatial planning to both promote food security, but also improve their health and well-being. And these people are located in UNESCO biospheres and in marine protected areas in these countries. And it's a truly fascinating study. The last study I'll just point to is the Seas, Oceans, and Public Health in Europe, or SOPHI project, again funded by Horizon 2020 and ended also last year. And what we were tasked to do was to scope out oceans and human health. So we listened to a whole bunch of different voices. In my case, I was particularly interested in the medical and public health community, because frankly, they're not usually in the marine space. And we were tasked with setting up a strategic research agenda and gathering evidence for that strategic research agenda. And this is just one of the pieces of evidence, and you can go to the website if you want to get more, but this is a paper recently published by Becca Short and colleagues. And what they did is they applied evidence synthesis scoping, and they looked in peer-reviewed literature for papers that had both marine exposures and documented health outcomes. And it's very interesting. It's sort of a heat map as to where we should be doing work. And at least as of a year ago, when they finished the scoping review, there was no good evidence for directly showing human health impacts for plastic pollution. Clearly, that's a very rapidly growing field, but I think it was interesting. In terms of the strategic research agenda, we identified 3 areas, and part of it was these were areas where public health, medical, and marine people could collaborate together. The first one was marine biodiversity, biotechnology, and medicine. The second was sustainable seafood and healthy people. And the third was blue spaces, tourism, and well-being. It was led by the European Marine Board with 20 interdisciplinary experts. They looked over all the evidence we had gathered, and they incorporated elements of the Sustainable Development Goals, equity, sustainability, and innovation. So I think the real challenge for people who are involved in the community of environment and human health are really the ocean, is how do we encourage others to care about the ocean, particularly, by the way, people who don't have experience with it. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of people and groups and communities that are trying to involve people in ocean and human health. So my first example is in Spain, in Catalonia, in a small town called Rosas, which shares a peninsula with Cap de Creus, which is a marine protected area. And Dr. Josep Lloret, who is a marine biologist, has worked and actually grew up in Rosas, has worked with colleagues over a decade to set up a so-called chair of ocean and human health. With the University of Girona, the town of Rosas, the local fishery cooperative, the marine protected area. And in real time, they are trying to explore how can they live sustainably in a place that depends on tourism, fisheries, and on an increasingly polluted Mediterranean environment. The Blue Climate Initiative is something I think people might be interested in. They recently gave out community awards for ocean-related climate solutions, and their focus is on climate change and the ocean. They also have recently advertised a $1 million Ocean Innovation Prize, which must involve technology, innovation, and communities. And their overall vision is that of blue communities in action, actually networking and linking up blue communities around the world to share research, training, data, et cetera. And I also would like to flag the idea that we have learned a lot in the last couple of years about how climate change can be completely turned around as an issue by the action of our youth. And frankly, the youth is the one who's going to inherit the mess we've made. So involving them in everything, I think, to do with the ocean is highly recommended. I'm now going to turn briefly or add a few more minutes around something that is relatively new in my life, but quite inspiring, the National Health Service, or NHS Ocean. Over the last 30 years that I've been involved in ocean and human health, I've often been the only physician in the room or the only public health person in the room. And a couple of months ago, in the middle of a pandemic, across the Atlantic, because I'm currently in the US, I came across Dr. Richard Hickson and Dr. Georgina Salmon. And Richard is an anesthesiologist and Georgie is a GP, a general practitioner in the UK NHS. And they're really inspiring people. And I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the work they're doing. And the background to this is that there is finally, and this again is 30 years in, an awakening in the public health and medical community that climate change can cause human health impacts, both directly and indirectly. And this really is only in the last decade to few years that this has been happening. And one of the outshoots of this has been that the healthcare systems are awakening to their own impact on both carbon and other environmental impacts. And so this is from Sir Simon Stevens, who's the National Health Service Chief Executive in the UK. And he notes that if health services across the world were their own country, they would be the 5th largest emitter of CO2, and I would add other pollutants, on the planet. And so the UK is now focusing on a whole area called Greener NHS. There's also been some work done on where are the carbon and other pollutant footprints in the National Health Service in the UK and elsewhere. And what brought Richard and Georgie to me, and I found totally fascinating, is that 60% of the CO2 emissions come from the supply chain of the UK NHS, but 80% of equipment, medicines, and chemicals arrive via container ship. And now you'll see how we get to the connection with NHS Ocean. And as you know, being a highly marine focused community, there are other shipping impacts besides CO2. There are other air pollutants, there's waste, including plastics, marine traffic, ecosystem destruction, invasive species transfer, noise, and a huge impact on particularly large marine mammal communities. And so to that end, and for some more information, I'll tell you in just a minute, Georgie and Richard decided to form NHS Ocean with the idea of educating, advocating, and collaborating around this large idea that the NHS, the National Health Service, not only in the UK, but around the world, is impacting on the ocean. And I'll start off with Richard. He is completely enamored of looking at how shippers and the whole issue of the supply chain. And so he's been involved somewhat in talking to how these ships could become more decarbonized with less environmental impact. But his main impact has been interacting with suppliers and trying to bring the NHS and suppliers of the NHS together. And remember, the NHS has suppliers in everything from food to needles, and to use them to put pressure on the shipping industry, which brings 80% of the equipment to the NHS in the UK, forcing the shipping industry possibly to become more transparent, think about things like waste and carbon impact. And he's been working with a group now called the Clean Cargo Members, and they're a growing group of both suppliers and shippers that are trying to at least start to set some of these parameters, and also, even more important, I think, collect data. So Georgie, on the other hand, is very focused not on the big picture, but on primary care, the delivery of healthcare to the individual, the community, by GPs and others. There has been quite a bit of work done on carbon hotspots and stuff in general practice, and pharmaceuticals, it turns out, have a big impact in terms of carbon, as well as other pollutants. But Georgie and I are particularly interested in the Center for Sustainable Healthcare that emphasizes not only the pollutants, including carbon from primary care, but also that if we can prevent chronic diseases and delay them and decrease them, as well as empower patients, we actually can make an impact directly and indirectly on the natural environment. And so what Georgie does is she talks about Sally, a patient of hers, and tries to communicate that due to systemic constraints, Sally is kind of stuck. She's got type 2 diabetes, hypertension, she's overweight, she uses a number of medications, which, by the way, often end up in the natural environment. She works full-time in office, she has 2 children, she's relatively inactive. And when you ask about barriers to movement, they're legion. So she's exhausted, the working environment is sitting, their cultural norms don't encourage it. She doesn't really understand that physical activity is good for her mental health and well-being, and her local community has very little access. But she wants to control her diabetes and other health issues without increasing her meds. And so she chooses instead to increase her active commuting. And she does this both for herself and her family. And this has huge knock-on effects for her potentially, in that it can improve her mental health and physical well-being, but it also can help with her children. And by getting out more in the natural environment, there is the possibility of increased connectivity to nature, which in the long run may lead to more pro-environmental behavior. At the same time, by active commuting, she's not using cars, maybe a little bit of public transportation. This in turn can decrease air pollution, which can help not only her, but her whole community. And this in turn, through a lot of pathways that I won't get into, may also help and protect biodiversity. This whole area of using or interacting, hopefully sustainably, with the natural environment for prevention and treatment of chronic diseases, such as obesity, mental health issues, is now being called social prescribing and is growing on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world. And for example, these are examples in the UK of a number of social prescribing collaborators and programs that are using the marine and blue environments to help improve the health of the individual, the family, the community, using a sustainable healthcare approach and hopefully interacting sustainably with their natural environments. So going back to NHS Ocean, it's obviously the suppliers, but it's also blue prescribing. I think a huge amount of work needs to also be done in the waste chain. But to me, it's a very hopeful area. And I'll just advertise that we have a free webinar coming up on the 16th of September. That's 1 o'clock UK time. And please register. And also, we're just looking for more collaborators for people who might be interested in this area. I'll finally return, because it is the Ocean Decade, as you all know, that there is an opportunity to suggest Ocean Decade actions. And I personally would love an Ocean and Human Health Action Decade, or a decade action around marine protected areas and the communities that live in and around them, because I think those are positive hotspots or blue spots for learning to live more sustainably with the ocean. And also, obviously, this new area of NHS Ocean. This is a word cloud from an IOC webinar that we did last fall on oceans and human health. And we asked people at the end of the webinar, what's one word that means ocean and human health to you? And it always gives me hope that the central word is life, both our life and that of the ocean. And I just want to thank a whole lot of colleagues in the UK and around the world for working on this. And it's been really a wonderful experience, and I hope it continues and has real impact. If anybody wants to contact me, that's my email address. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lora, for this fascinating presentation and really important one. So if there are any questions, please type it in the chat. For now, no questions.
There's a question from Frida, I think, about the meta. Do you want to read it out, Patrizia, or are you okay with it?
I don't see the question from
Okay,
Frida. So if you see it, please go.
Yes. Okay. So much of the medical field uses disposable materials to prevent transfer of pathogens, but much contribute to waste, such as plastic and metal needles. This is really, I mean, particularly with COVID, this has been a huge issue and unfortunately growing. And there's this big disconnect. We've actually just recently finished a study where we looked at our local National Health Trust, which prior to COVID had signed up for a climate and environmental change emergency. They have been doing things like changing over to reusable, not just recyclable stuff. It turns out, for example, in the UK NHS, that 8 to 9 out of 10 healthcare providers want to do this. And yet, of course, with COVID, they have totally had to switch back to having to use a lot less reusable stuff. Now, this is starting to change, but I will flag a couple of issues. One issue is that you could argue that no one was really prepared for this pandemic, but going forward, why can't we set up processes and have equipment that is reusable even in pandemic situations? Another thing that happened is there are places, for example, in the UK, where the rates were not that bad for a while. So they now have huge stockpiles of things which they can't use and are not recyclable. So are there ways of then distributing that for people who could actually use it? Or is there a way to replace it? Is there a way to recycle it? But yes, and interestingly enough, the NHS Greener group, the things they identify as most difficult in terms of their carbon impact are asthma inhalers. How do we make asthma inhalers that are both, the gases are also not greenhouse gases, and how do we also make them disposable? The other big area they have is to have a greener ambulance. And they're actually going to procure, they're going to have a big competition to procure a greener ambulance, presumably electric powered, but issues also around that as well. But yes, you've actually pinned it. And I think the big issue here is if you look at NHS, National Health Services, they cover every sector known to man. But the part I didn't know is the impact on the ocean.
There is another question here related to mental health and blue space. Was there a difference between, say, a large body of water, example, Great Lakes, and actual oceans?
Well,
it's
a great story. So in our Blue Health project, we actually literally studied fountains all the way to coastlines. It was really fun. We did this thing with, it shows why interdisciplinary research is the way to go. We worked with a landscaped architect called Simon Bell, and he does something he calls, although it drives my colleagues crazy, he calls it acupuncture. And what he does is he'll work with a local community and say to them, okay, where's a blue space that you're not using? And what are the reasons? And are you interested in it? And it can range from things like it's dirty and dangerous, we can't access it, or I'm disabled, I can't get down there, or it's unsafe, you know, maybe there's drugs going on in that place, or people get mugged there. And we literally have case studies that are on the Blue Health website if you want to take a look of these different communities. So for example, very close to you, Patricia, outside of Barcelona, my colleague Mireia Gascon at IS Global worked with her local community to restore an ancient fountain. And the problem with the fountain area was that it was very dangerous at night and people didn't go there, even though there was a long history of people getting their water from there. They've completely redone it. And now it's like a place where people have parties. Of course, the pandemic doesn't help, but hopefully in the future, a place you can visit. And then we worked, for example, with a very poor community right next to the National Marine Aquarium in Plymouth, UK, not Massachusetts. And they had an area that was actually on the National Coast Path. The local community said, it's dirty, we never go there. And literally it was like half a block away. And so we worked with the community, and they actually designed with the landscape architect a sort of, oh God, I can't think of the name, like a little theater, an outdoor theater. They extended the access so that now disabled groups are using it, children access it. It's become safer, more people are using it. I think for me, the message in all of this, as Patricia kind of indicated earlier, is you've got to work with the local communities, particularly if you want it to be something that's going to last past a particular project. I don't know if that answered your question, but in all of them, blue space is better than urban or green space in terms of most people, not everyone.
There's an interesting question about ocean challenges, and I guess means type of ocean pollution, environmental change, and how linked they are or can be to our life.
Yeah, so one of my reasons for doing the kind of work I do is that I want people who normally don't care about the ocean to care. And one way to do that, I think, and I think it's true for things like climate change, is show that interacting with the oceans can be good, not just bad for your health. So I think that we care more about things, and behavioral research would say that as well, including pro-environmental behavior. We care more about them if we have exposure. So there's the whole issue of safe, equitable access. But we also care about them more if we think it actually does good things for our health and our family's health and our community's health. So I think there's a mixture here between getting people to care about the ocean, writ small and large, and then linking that to actions that they can do both locally and globally to protect the places that they love and protect the ocean if they love it. So that's sort of my underlying raison d'etre. My only fear is that if we produce too much evidence that interacting with blue spaces is good for your health and well-being, that we will love them to death. But I think if we can keep saying and interact with the natural environment sustainably, maybe we'll get people to appreciate but not destroy.
There's another question about, can you comment on human connectedness to blue and green spaces? Is there a pattern where water has a stronger human value?
Well, so I work with psychologists who could tell you this in much greater detail than I am. There is a huge group of people, for example, who react very similarly to looking at mountains and interacting with mountains. So it's not just blue space. Our earlier studies did compare blue and green space and cityscapes, and but the majority of people go for blue space. I personally like a mixture. Like, I don't like just looking at the ocean for endlessly. I like to see like an island, a person, or, you know, an eagle. So it is individualized. There's also research that shows that you imprint. So please take your children and grandchildren to blue and green spaces if you want them to grow up to appreciate those. And there's also research showing that people are disconnected from these spaces because they don't necessarily have access, particularly poor and minority communities around the world. Urban areas can have access to blue spaces. You know, you can have ponds, you can have fountains. If you're coastal or on a river, you can have it. But I think it is ultimately quite individual.
Mm-hmm. There is a question also from the same person about the SDG, and this global focus on water health can be a ticket to achieving the SDG related to water.
I mean, as I said, I really like the SDGs because I think if you look at them in terms of delivering them kind of from a high level, you have to focus on the health of the environment as well as the health of people. I personally am anxious about focusing only on one SDG. I mean, when I write a grant, I put SDG 14, like everybody else. But I try to include things like equality or communities working together, because I worry about the siloing it. In terms of water, yes, but another thing I will point out is a lot of the SDGs are very focused on risk. And again, not so much on opportunities and positive messages, you know, like they could be reframed like, if we can do this, we could have X in terms of health benefits, for example. So I guess my feeling about SDGs is we need to think of them as very interconnected. And there's been lots of work now on sort of matrices. I think the water one is important, clearly, and it clearly links to SDG 14 and others. I just would like to make sure that we do interconnect and think also, or express it at least, on what are the benefits that we can get out of doing this, not just keeping our finger in the dike or trying to avoid a risk.
There's also another interesting question about linking policy and science. And so now that we have this in highly urbanized poor areas with limited access to blue and green space, how can we solve this?
Well, I think, you know, we're not the only ones doing this research. There are people around the world doing this, and clearly urbanized areas are really important. A couple of thoughts. One issue is equity of access. There is not equity of access in most urban areas. Mostly, if poor people are given access to blue and green spaces, they're often highly degraded, dangerous, et cetera. So there's an issue around equity of access. And part of that also is the sort of natural environment state of those places. Another issue that was brought up to me when I gave a talk at the IOC was a delegate from Africa said to me, in his country, some of the poorest populations in his country live in coastal areas. And what was I going to do about that? And I guess part of my, what I would love to do about is to work with them and maybe show them that other countries have used coastal areas to become very wealthy, and maybe they could stay involved and be able to live more sustainably. I think another thing is we need to learn lessons. This is one of the things we did in the Blue Health Study, from exemplars of people who are increasing access sustainably to blue and green spaces in urban areas. And I also think, although I'm not convinced this is the be all and the end all, but remember, there's a whole bunch of people who can't get to blue and green spaces because they're disabled or ill or very elderly. And there is a place, I think, for things like virtual reality. So and we have some research in that area in addition to what I showed you. So there's no one answer to this. I think another thing we did in the Blue Health study is we created tools so that you can monitor and evaluate. If you're going to do an intervention, fix up a fountain with a community, you use these tools to go and say, okay, what's the environment look like? What are the people's health and well-being like? You do the intervention, and then you go back and see if you made a difference. You redo the same evaluation and compare it. I think we need more of that, of providing evidence that interactions, particularly involving local communities, can make a big difference. And then, of course, the big issue is how do you sustain that?
Another question here is about my negative impact on the coastal increase. How do we balance benefit with potential detrimental effect as more people interact with people with blue space?
And this is my personal nightmare. And I would look to communities such as you guys to have some answers for that. I personally think that the increase, and I believe it's in the SDGs, minimally in the Ocean Decade actions to increase marine protected areas. And from the little I know, remember, I'm a physician epidemiology, I would advocate for some areas that are relatively no-go and other areas where we work with populations who have lived there maybe for a long time and try to learn how they have been able to sustain that. The other thing I've noticed in our Blue Communities project is a number of these marine protected areas are under huge impacts, not only from things like climate change, but from, for example, economic migration or political migration. So I think they're sort of microcosms of what we're going to have to do in the future. So I do think there's a piece of monitoring and working with those communities so that we can learn lessons that will help us protect our own green spaces and blue spaces. And the last thing is, if you look at the people who are involved in social prescribing, there's the healthcare providers, but there's also the providers of the green and blue spaces. And many of them are groups like wildlife refuge places. And a number of them incorporate things like citizen science as part of the social prescribing intervention. And I think that's very clever because it both serves, the citizen science point of view, but it also involves people in understanding at a much deeper level those natural environments. And it can document if there are problems too.
I have a question related to what you just said. How do we harmonize blue space and green space for different type of communities at different incomes, when we know that, for example, of course, area with green space and blue space, they're becoming the most expensive ones, and then you have this type of injustice, social injustice. So I think it's quite difficult to solve this issue.
Yeah, and again, I will point that that's not universally true. In very poor areas, some of the poorest coastal communities are often. I personally think it has to be part of the whole planning process. It has to be inculcated into planning. It has to be inculcated into housing and infrastructure planning as well. I think the other thing, although this may raise alarm bells, I also think there's a certain amount of work that is very useful in the idea of working with economists to value blue and green spaces and use that in conjunction with showing, for example, health co-benefits. So, for example, one of my colleagues, Matt White, was able to show that that regular walking in green spaces saved the UK NHS literally billions of pounds. I think that kind of sort of dual valuing what you have, but also what are the health co-benefits can be very helpful. The other thing is a lot of poor communities are located in very environmentally poor areas at risk, for example, for climate change and sea level rise. So as they try to do adaptation things, seawalls, for example, think about the co-benefits that you can have by making that seawall accessible to that population and involve that population in how they would like to see that seawall accessed so that they can improve their mental health and well-being, and you can protect them and others from sea level rise, for example. So it's the whole idea of not just focusing on health of humans or just the environment, but trying to get them interlinked. And also, I guess, working across sectors. But it's not easy, and particularly in places like the US, where inequalities are really growing, and where the upshot of the pandemic is that people, the prices for blue and green spaces are going off the wall, thanks to the pandemic. So I think, yeah, I think there's going to have to be major intervention by government.
More to do there.
Yes.
Yeah. There is one last question here about younger folk, about prevention. So there's this concept of prevention being important, climate change, and is there potential to use these as motivator, particularly in younger generation?
Okay. I don't know if I want to take on the whole anti-vaxxer thing. I live on both sides of the Atlantic, and I have to say my colleagues in Europe are sort of appalled by what's going on in the US. I feel that the big issue there is that it's become politicized, and that scientific arguments are probably not what's going to help here. I'm not sure what is going to help, but I don't think, I mean, my personal view, and this is, I'm not an expert in this area. I unfortunately think the US, for example, is going to be the new place in the next year or so where all the variants come with, because we're not getting vaccinated. Having said that, I think the whole idea of prevention is stronger and understood better by the younger generation, because they keep turning to us and saying, why couldn't you have prevented it? They can see the historic record of people 50 years ago in the oceanography community saying the carbon's going like this. They can see, they can read that people have, that COP has been going on now, COP 26 is coming up. So I also think on a sort of public health level, if you look at monies that are spent currently by National Health Service, for example, the UK National Health Service only spends 4 to 6% of its budget on prevention. Now, we're never going to prevent death, but we definitely can delay chronic diseases, and we can increase people's quality of life. And at the same time, if you do that, you will have less impacts on the natural environment. There's less use of the National Health Service. The National Health Service has fewer drugs, fewer equipment. If we could all just kind of do great, and die, that would be the best for the natural environment. And not do other resource stuff.
There is another question for you. And it's here, how do you think coastal countries should balance destruction of their blue spaces and tourism? I'm from a country where there is high tourism for our blue space, but end of the tourism season always leaves massive pollution in these spaces. And this is a very common problem also in the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah, not just the Mediterranean. And it's one of the things I wonder about communities that are living, anyway. There's a big blue tourism movement. And there are people, when I was working with the Blue Climate Initiative that I mentioned in my talk, they had a whole subgroup on blue tourism, and it was really inspiring. There are people at the national level, for example, the assistant head of tourism for Colombia was on Sandra Howard was on our committee. And they realize that, and this is from a both selfish and unselfish point of view, they are in the process of destroying the very thing that brings in the money. So I think that it's a combination. I think personally, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I think the good news is that people are really trying to do this. It ranges from things like taxes, education, obviously. We have colleagues in Spain, two NGOs who did a really interesting project they have a huge network around Europe of blue tourism. And they worked with people who are the blue tourism operators, and they both showed them evidence that, blue tourism is important and it's good for your health and well-being, but they urged them, and they actually did it, to combine citizen science projects with their blue tourism activities, And they also pointed out that the operator's health and well-being is affected by the quality of the natural environment, as is the health of the clients. So they actually would measure their own health and well-being over the time that they were delivering this, and they also measured that of the clients. That's very much of a microcosm approach. And then on the big picture, I think there has to be a range of things. And I'm not an expert, but I think we have to involve people like economists, behaviorists, like what has been shown to work. You know, there's a whole group of people who call themselves the behavioral economists who talk about the nudge. What is the nudge for blue tourism? And is it specific to different groups of tourists? A whole nother area that no one is talking about much, but Josep Lloret is, my colleague in Drosas, is the cruise industry, which if you actually start to play it out, although it's poorly monitored, has a huge environmental impact and is a huge portion of tourism and probably will be again, even with the pandemic issues. So I don't think it's simple. I think it's really important, and we have to be careful because we use it as a carrot often for communities to help them from an economic point of view, but they can end up with a destroyed resource that doesn't help their health and well-being or that of the ocean.